Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. On the brink of war, diplomacy continues to try to resolve the Ukraine crisis. This Monday, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz went to Kiev to meet with the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenksy. This as a ring of Russian troops around Ukraine tightens. Let's show you a map that perhaps illustrates best the placement of Russia's troops around Ukraine's borders. Those Russian forces on exercise in Belarus are within striking distance of Kiev. The 120,000 or more stationed still on the eastern Ukraine border overlooking the Donbass region, the Russian-speaking area where the separatists have been in conflict with Kiev since 2014. Meanwhile, more than a dozen countries, including the UK and the US, have urged their citizens to leave Ukraine, warning commercial flights may soon not be possible. Several airlines have already suspended their flights, and analysts are predicting that other international carriers may well follow suit because of the soaring insurance costs they are now facing. Diplomatic staff are being evacuated too, the United States pulling out almost all of its staff from the Kiev embassy, a move echoed by several other Western states. France, according to the Foreign Office website France Diplomatie, France is currently monitoring the situation. So possibly time to talk on Ukraine. Let's get the thoughts of our guests and let's introduce them to you. First of all, here in the studio, Joachim Bitterlich, who's a former European diplomatic and security policy advisor to the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and a former German ambassador to NATO from 1998 to 1999. So thank you very much for being with us. Joining us in London, Nikolai Petrov, Senior Research Fellow, the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Also, Professor in the Political Science Department at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Joining us from Warsaw, Maria Zolkina, political analyst at the Iko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And in Kiev, Gulliver Cragg, France 24's correspondent. Before the guests begin talking, let's take a listen to Olaf Scholz and Volodymyr Zelensky speaking earlier in Kiev.
I'm making it clear once again here in Kiev that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable for Germany. We therefore expect Russia to take clear steps to de-escalate the current tensions. For Germany, it's clear that further military aggression against Ukraine would have serious political, economic and geostrategic consequences for Russia. I will underline that in Moscow tomorrow as well.
Ми розуміємо, що членством в НАТО ми б хотіли, і так це було б забезпечення нашої безпеки, нашої територіальної цілісності. І також це закріплено і в законодавстві України, в Конституції України. Тому, якщо б ми розставляли з вами точки над «і», ми відповіді з вами знаємо, і терміни були б скорочені щодо майбутнього України.
Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Before that, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, on his visit to Kiev. He's off to Moscow on the next stage of this diplomatic mission. Let's bring in Gulliver Cragg, who's in Kiev for France 24, for a sense of how things are on the ground there and up in the air too. Gulliver, tell us about the situation where you are.
Well, definitely the tension has risen by a notch, particularly with the departure of numerous charter flights and private jets on Sunday. The super rich seem to be leaving the country. These embassies evacuating, the OSCE mission losing its British, American, and I think the staff of some other countries as well. That's the mission that's been observing the conflict going on in Donbass for the past nearly 8 years. So it's going to be hard for that mission to continue its work with so many of its members being told by their respective countries where they're from which they've been seconded to that mission to go. All of these things are making people feel a bit worried, but Ukrainian analysts maintain, and it'll be interesting to hear what Maria Zolkina has to say, whether her views have changed since last time I spoke to her, that if there's to be military escalation, it's much more likely to be in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region, than an attack on Kiev. And that's why the Ukrainian government and numerous Ukrainian officials have been trying to say, don't panic. And Volodymyr Zelenksy has said that he thought that the decision by various countries to evacuate their embassies or move their embassies further west was a bad decision. It's causing damage to the Ukrainian economy, to the currency, to the investment climate. Lots of people's financial decisions are, of course, on hold. Now's hardly the time, for example, to be buying or selling property in Kiev, as you can imagine.
Gulliver, thank you very much indeed. Stay with us. I'll take up your invitation to bring in Maria Zolkina straight away, a political analyst at the Ilko Kocherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Maria, you heard what Gulliver had to say there. Give us a kind of like a rebound on what you've just heard.
I still agree with the idea that the most probable direction of attack on the side of Russia is the very east of Ukraine. So namely, when Russia will use the occupied territories of Donbas as the platform to start land operation. And all the information coming from, for instance, intelligence service of Ukraine and from my, for instance, own resources, because I have been dealing with the topic since 2014. So there are a lot of preparations, not only military ones, but also preparations made by so-called law enforcement bodies of self-proclaimed republics in occupied Donbas. So they are not only prepared to try to occupy new territories of currently government-controlled part of Ukraine, but as well, to clean up the settlements. So preparations are of different types, and the good news are in this regard is that Ukrainian army actually has been preparing better for this scenario better than for anyone else. And for instance, if we will compare what messages about possible invasion or possible aggressions were coming recently from our foreign partners, they were mainly speaking about full-fledged invasion, full-fledged aggression, while Ukrainian army and Ukrainian military experts were mainly talking about specific local operations where Russia, with a high extent, is going to have more success than in case of full-fledged invasion from different directions.
Maria Zolkina there in Warsaw. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to Gulliver in Kiev before he leaves us to do his job of correspondent, because obviously we need to get Gulliver to cover all aspects of this story for us there. Gulliver, before you go, tell us...
I want to tell you the truth. I'm leaving because I'm going to go to the cinema, because life in Kiev does carry on.
That was my question. How is life in Kiev? How is life in Kiev? Tell us more about life in Kiev.
Life in Kiev does go on as normal. There isn't an atmosphere of panic in Kiev. There isn't an atmosphere of panic in Kiev. Everything's open. People are getting on with their lives, but definitely people are becoming more worried. The more that these, statements from the Americans come, and when they're backed up by actual moves that have considerable impact on, the lives of American employees of the American state, such as the embassy and stuff, and other organizations as well. Of course, that makes you think, well, maybe they know something. Maybe these Ukrainian oligarchs and politicians who are reported to have left on these private and chartered jets are many of them people who have got quite strong connections in Russia. So that also makes people think maybe they know something. But my general impression is that people are rather heeding the government's advice to not panic.
Gulliver Cragg, enjoy the cinema. Thank you so very much indeed for joining us. Gulliver Cragg, our correspondent there in Kiev. Great to see you, sir. Let's bring in here in the studio Joachim Bitterlich, former European diplomatic and security policy advisor to the one-time German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. His successor, Olaf Scholz, so many years down the line now, is on that mission in Kiev. From what he said, what is your kind of gut feeling about what's going on?
Well, it's after Macron's first step. It's now Olaf Scholz's second step. I would have preferred to see them both together in Moscow and in Kiev in order to try to de-escalate the whole development. It's not an easy situation at all. The biggest blame Putin could implement to the US would be not to enter into Ukraine on Wednesday. It would be the biggest blame for the CIA. And therefore, this would mean a harsh punishment to the US government, to the US president. But I don't think we are in front of an entry of an aggression now, a military aggression into the east of Ukraine. Please don't forget the past of the Donbas. The Donbas has been the center of a Soviet armament industry for tanks and for planes. Don't forget this in their past. And therefore, there is this certain, bigger interest in that area than in others. And don't forget the famous discussion between Putin and Donald Tusk while Prime Minister of Poland, where Putin proposed, both were talking in German, the division of the Ukraine in two parts. The western part going to Poland and the eastern part going back to Russia. There is this specific sensitivity about the Ukraine in the east. And I regret this situation for the Ukrainians, for themselves. They seem, having got the independence, the sovereignty, after the end of the Soviet Union. But at the end, when you talk to Russians, there has been, let's say, an agreement to disagree between the Russians and the Western world. Despite of certain agreements on nuclear arms in the Ukraine, yes, but there has, let's say, this feeling of the Russians of an agreement to disagree, and at the same time, Russians to some extent feel still, to some extent, betrayed by the West with the expansion of NATO towards East. I don't think that the Baltic states are a problem for the Russians, nor Poland. The heart of the Russian problem is the Ukraine. And I think I go back a bit in this field. Till years ago, I think in the Western world, we were convinced that the Ukraine should not enter into NATO, at least in the foreseeable time, let's say the next 20, 40 years. Then afterwards we will see always. This was our, let's say, conviction in the past. It's sure, on the other hand, that the Ukrainians who are, let's say, a building of a nation, step by step, they would feel more secure under the umbrella of the Americans and of NATO. It's clear. But on the other hand, I think we have all in Europe a keen interest in order to de-escalate, in order to come back to an old idea we had in the 90s, called by some people in the West or in the East an illusion to some extent, or good feelings if you want. It's a common European security architecture where the Russians don't have any reason, let's say, to go back to their, let's say, often existing paranoia to be encircled by the whole world, by the Chinese in the East, the Iranians in the South, Turkey, and by NATO in the West. I think certain guarantees should be possible and linked, let's say, to a certain status of Ukraine and therefore de-escalation. I think it's perfectly possible if you want, if we want, but it will be difficult, it's true, towards a state, the Ukraine, which is like still in the phases of nation building. I've learned something different in my past about the Ukraine. Ukraine was consisting of 5 parts in the end, and with a certain, let's say, administrative regulations, yes. But the Ukraine is now in a phases where the Ukrainians feel, especially looking at the threat from the east and the north, in the phases of nation building where they would like see to defend themselves, and I understand.
On those words, Joachim, I'm sorry to cut you off. Word has just dropped here on the wire service from Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French Foreign Minister, on Ukraine. All the elements are together here for a strong offensive from Russia. This is Jean-Yves Le Drian, the French Foreign Minister, saying that. So clearly along the lines that you were just talking about, Joachim. Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Nikolai Petrov from the Chatham House think tank in London. He's a senior research fellow there at Russia and Eurasia Programme. Nikolai, I hope you can hear us. I hope you heard what Joachim had to say as well, certainly about the issue of Ukraine and NATO. We've heard earlier today the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenksy, saying that he will continue to push to get Ukraine into NATO. And of course, this is something, one of the baselines that Vladimir Putin has set, hasn't he? He wants in no way, shape or form for Ukraine to enter NATO.
We are getting mixed signals about this, and you know that yesterday Ukrainian ambassador to London did not exclude the possibility for Ukraine to refuse from applying for NATO membership if only it can prevent the war. And he was supported by British government until Ukrainian government did not tell that it was a kind of misunderstanding. But I would emphasize that not only this is about Ukraine, this is about European security architecture in general. And what we see, I think, it's understandable and rational claim from the side of Russian leadership to negotiate about how it should look like. The existing architecture appeared in early 90s at a time when the West did celebrate the victory in the Cold War, which was not taken as a failure by Russia that time, but Russia used to be too weak to claim for any conditions. Now it's different, and I think it's very important to understand that not only it goes about Ukraine, but it goes about the balance in general. And when speaking about this balance, we should have in mind that the situation now is very different from what it used to be 30 years ago in terms of the fact that no more there is single superpower which can provide for the order everywhere in the world. There are several other countries on rise, and the balance did change essentially. Whether it's possible now or not to negotiate new conditions, to think about the new security architecture, that's the question. But so far we do see almost like a performance, if not to think in terms of potentially horrible consequences. It looks like pre-staged war. And first of all, I do hope that the probability of large-scale military action is low. Second, I do think that even smaller-scale military action is not that probable, although more probable than large-scale war. And anyway, I think it's still possible to negotiate, but we should understand what exactly we should negotiate about. This is not only about Ukrainian membership in NATO, which is, rationally speaking, out of question regardless of any different claims. But we should think in terms of how the European security architecture should look like.
Nikolai Petrov, Chatham House State in London, thank you very much indeed for that insight. France then warning all elements are in place for a major offensive by Russia against Ukraine. Those are the words of the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian that has just come into us. We have the claim earlier on, the call earlier on from Volodymyr Zelenksy that he says he wants to push to get Ukraine into NATO. Two more things to tell you. We have a new guest, John Herbst, Director of the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council. John, I'll bring you in a second. Before I bring you in, the other thing I want to tell you all about is that we have Antony Blinken speaking to our correspondent in Washington, Sonia Dridi. Let's listen to the words of the US Secretary of State.
We're deeply concerned that Russia could take action against Ukraine as early as this week. Everything we're seeing in terms of the deployment of Russian forces around Ukraine, on every side of Ukraine, leads us to that conclusion. Russia, instead of de-escalating, has been escalating, putting more and more forces in. And so we're deeply concerned about that. The path to diplomacy remains open. We are doing everything we possibly can to convince Russia that it should take the diplomatic path, the path of dialogue to resolve whatever differences exist peacefully. But if it pursues aggression, we're fully prepared for that in close coordination with all of our European allies and partners.
Antony Blinken, US Secretary of State, speaking to our correspondent, France 24 correspondent in Washington, Sonia Dridi. We're also hearing here, coming in, more stuff coming in on Ukraine, of course, as we're speaking. The Kremlin says it's ready for further talks with the West. So that's perhaps backing up the feeling that more talking has to be carried out. Time to talk indeed. Let's bring in our new guest, John Herbst, Director of the Eurasia Centre at the Atlantic Council, former US Ambassador to Ukraine 2003 to 2006, and also Uzbekistan as well. Sir, thanks for being with us. We appreciate your time. Could I get your reaction to those words from Antony Blinken?
I think it reflects a very consistent Biden policy over the past several months, that we will take many steps short of actually committing U.S. military forces to Ukraine to stop Kremlin aggression. And I think this is absolutely essential because Putin is a revisionist. He wants to change the security order established in Europe at the end of the Cold War, which was actually merely an amendment to security order established in Europe at the end of World War II. And he is a serial provocateur. And he's gotten away with aggression in Georgia and seizure of Crimea because the West, in a very short-sighted fashion, looked at each of these crises as a crisis in himself, as opposed to seeing a pattern to Putin's behavior. If Putin had been faced with serious sanctions for his aggression in Georgia in 2008, he probably would not have seized Crimea. If he had faced serious sanctions for seizing and annexing Crimea, he probably would not have started his war in Donbass. So finally, he's now facing the prospect of a serious response before he commits a new aggression. And I think the danger to the West is not simply Putin insisting on what Ukraine must do. It's Putin's ambitions which go beyond that. And let's keep in mind that all we've talked about so far in this program today is Ukraine and NATO. It's worth remembering that this crisis began not because of Ukraine perhaps joining NATO, but because Ukraine was considering a free trade agreement with the EU. That's why Putin began this war. So he has ambitions which are directly contradictory to the Paris Charter, which Russia signed, the Helsinki Accords, which the Soviet Union signed. And we have a vital stake in making sure that Putin's aggression does not go beyond Ukraine, for example, in touching the Baltic states. It's worth remembering as well that, the first NATO summit after Moscow's aggression in Ukraine took place in Great Britain. And then President Obama went to the Baltic states to reassure them of Western support in the face of Moscow's aggression against Ukraine. And what did Putin do at that time? After Obama left, while the NATO summit was in session, they kidnapped I think it was an Estonian security official to demonstrate to the Baltic states that, no, you better worry, boys and girls. So we had to stop Putin and stop him in Ukraine.
John, thank you very much indeed. Let's show everybody who's watching this program the placement of NATO weapons across Eastern Europe. We have a map which illustrates that, as you can see. This is something, John, I'll get your comment first, that Vladimir Putin will point to as Western aggression. What would your response be to that?
That's a joke. He puts 100,000 plus forces on Ukraine's border. He puts a flotilla near Ukrainian waters in the Black Sea, and he complains when the West puts a couple thousand or maybe 4,000 or 5,000 troops in NATO's east. This doesn't pass the laugh test, and any Westerner who entertains it really doesn't understand how things work.
John, thank you. Maria Zolkina in Warsaw, political analyst at the Ilko Kusherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Can I get your reaction to that one too? Vladimir Putin will point to that and say this is Western aggression against Russia.
Of course, this is an old, let's say, narrative used by Russia for years, and especially starting from 2014. And this is the pure manipulation when it comes, for instance, for the idea to stop extension of NATO and inclusion of Ukraine to NATO membership, to NATO members, simply because if, according to Russia's position, if according to certain European politicians and experts, that Ukraine is still so far from being a member of NATO, then why to start escalation and why to start this kind of political and even military blackmailing of Ukraine and of the whole West? And that's why, of course, Ukraine and our Western alliance under no circumstances should follow this logic of manipulations, and under no circumstances should follow this kind of manipulation. And in this regard, I would say that from Ukrainian side, we suspect, I mean both politicians and expert community, that our Western allies will be not only, trying to appease Putin about his fears about possible NATO invasion or interference into Russia's area of interest, but at the same time, instead, to give him a clear signal that NATO future, including Ukrainian question, will not be discussed with Russia, just simply because this is a political suicide of NATO to define anything. And one more comment in this regard is that it seems that even if Ukrainian side will refuses now, for instance, though I really pretty sure this will never happen. But even if Ukraine refuses from the NATO membership perspective as of now, it will not satisfy Russia, just simply because Russia is not about just membership perspective for Ukraine. It goes about active, deep relations between NATO and Ukraine. Without being a member, without having a membership perspective, Ukraine has started pretty close cooperation with NATO since 4 or 5 years, and Russia will not be satisfied if this dynamic of bilateral relation between Ukraine and NATO will be preserved. So it's not just about formal issues, and that's why we have to be preventive in terms of sanctions, in terms of political signals to Russia, in order to limit itself with its, political appetites.
Maria, thank you very much indeed. Your words there, I think, echoing those of John Herbst earlier on, talking about that importance of the deal on trade done between Ukraine and the EU, raising alarm bells in the backyard there in the Kremlin. Maria Stolkina in Warsaw, thank you. Nikolai Petrov, can I bring you in to talk more about that kind of missile defense system that's across the east of Europe and the fact that Vladimir Putin regards this as a threat? Does Russia genuinely feel threatened by NATO because of this? Or is this just a pretext to try to repeat a land grab of the style of 2014 in Crimea?
Yes, I think that Russian military do feel the fact that NATO is coming to the borders of Russia as a real threat. Well, perhaps they are wrong, but I do think they are sincere in this. Second, I do think they feel NATO being weak now, especially after Afghanistan and this humiliation and failure of NATO and the United States. And finally, I think the game is about Russia and the United States, with Ukraine and European countries playing a secondary role, if any, in this game. And now let's ask ourselves, if it goes about national interests, and besides of who now is the leader of Russia, we should accept that Russia does have national interests, just like any other country, like Ukraine or like the United States. But we are taking for sure that the United States can have national interests in Ukraine and Central and Eastern Europe, which is several thousand miles away from the United States. But it looks strange for us that Russia, Moscow, does have national interests connected to Ukraine, which is the biggest and the most important neighbor of Russia. So I would say that what was clearly formulated by Putin, it's the fact that he is afraid of using Ukraine by the West as anti-Russia. This is not only about membership in NATO. This is about the fact that there are certain conditions, there is certain military cooperation which is going on even without Ukrainian membership. And if to remember, and I do agree, partly with John Herbst, if to look at 2013, when negotiations were going on about free trade agreement with European Union, let me remind you that the condition was to break relations with Russia and, to construct relations with European Union. This is exactly what Russian political elites are afraid of, that the West is trying to take entirely control over former and actual Russia's neighbors, if not allies, and to bring them into NATO, European Union, in a hostile way with regard to Russia.
Indeed, this is one of the crux of the matter in many ways, isn't it? I think that Vladimir Putin has one perspective on what Ukraine is. He thinks it's actually still Russian territory. And of course, people in Ukraine have maybe a different opinion and maybe feel they have the right to make their own decisions and decide where they take the country. And perhaps this is at the heart of the matter. I'd just like to show you all and everybody who's watching a cartoon coming from the German media. This has been obviously produced because Olaf Scholz, the chancellor, has gone to Kiev. And this depicts Scholz there walking between the tanks or as a popcorn seller might at a sporting event or at an entertainment event in some way, shape or form. It's a fairly light-hearted way of looking at what Chancellor Scholz has been doing today in going to Kiev and talking with Volodymyr Zelenksy. And of course, he's off to take that popcorn stand into Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin in the next 24 hours to try to resolve perhaps in some way, shape or form the situation. And Joachim Bitterlich, can I bring you in here on this point? We know about the importance of Ukraine in terms of Russian energy supply into Europe, and we know about a project called Nord Stream 2. And one wonders whether Olaf Scholz will be taking those words, Nord Stream 2, to Vladimir Putin and saying, listen, this is at stake now. If you misbehave, we will basically cut off Nord Stream 2.
This could be one of the consequences of any, let's say, aggression, military aggression of the Russians to the Ukraine.
So far he hasn't mentioned that, though, has he?
Could be. He has not yet mentioned this because, to some extent, the Germans feel in a trap. The Russians have always been, let's say, a reliable supplier of gas in Western Europe and to Germany. Second, the Germans, the storage of gas in Germany, which is under control of Gazprom, don't forget it, is nearly empty. And neither the Americans nor Qatar are able, let's say, to fill this gap, if necessary, if the Russians stop it. Therefore, the Germans are, let's say, in a mess to some extent. It will put, let's say, serious problems to them. It's at the same time due, let's say, to the new policy of the new German government in the longer run to renounce to nuclear energy and to put the whole strength on renewables. And therefore, you need, for a transition for the next 30 years, you need gas. And you need even to build new gas terminals. And therefore, it's a certain mess to the German policy. But on the other hand, I think Olaf Scholz will underline one thing. Putin, dear Vladimir, you have reached one thing in the last weeks. It's the revival of NATO. And Germany will be in total solidarity with NATO in this field. Don't have any wrong expectation from the Germans. The Germans are, let's say, have always been in favor of a natural bridge between the Europeans and Russia, but don't take it on that weak side you think we could be. And I think the problem is on the other side what I call the perception of the Russians, the perception of Putin, hardening in the last years. You have mentioned here the year 2014 and before, but don't forget the years before. I think in the 90s, 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago, there have been, let's say, signals of the Russians, let's say, to come to a new relationship with the EU, something which they have never understood before, EU. They don't know what it is. They know what NATO is, but not EU. They have never understood this approach of the Europeans. And I think there is a certain deception of the Russians. They feel, in a sense, as a loser, of being defeated. And no one has been listening to the signals of, let's say, that weaker Russia. Now they feel in a stronger way, and they try, let's say, to overcome this. You may call this revisionist policy. Yes, it is, to some extent. But I think it's in our interest, I think, on the one hand, to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. On the other hand, let's say, to renegotiate, to look with the Russians where possible ways and means are, let's say, to develop what we have been dreaming about in the past, an overall European security structure.
Indeed. You're coming back to this idea of this overall European security structure, which clearly you feel is incredibly important.
We have been negotiating, discussing this in the early 90s, yes. And we have lost that feeling, let's say, in the second half of the 90s, due to the Republicans, due to Bush Jr., due to American campaigning. And I think we have underestimated, I think, the importance of Ukraine to the West as to the East. And I do not forget But even in the beginning of this new century, we were thinking about the Ukraine as the bridge between the former West and the former East. And we were reflecting on this. We have lost that feeling, I think. And the Russians have understood one thing. The EU accession is a first step to NATO. And don't forget what Putin once said to the Finnish president, being on the border to Finland. There is a certain debate in Finland about NATO. And he said, today on the other side of the border, you are the Finns. Once you are in NATO, you are the enemy for us. This is Russian perception, I regret. And we have to live with the perception in politics. And first of all, you have to think about what I call the other. What are the Russians thinking? What are the Ukrainians thinking? What's the way to help best of all of us? And I think Olaf Scholz will do his visit tomorrow in Moscow in strong consultation and in agreement with Emmanuel Macron. And I think it would be excellent if they succeed both in, let's say, a certain comeback of Europe in this place of negotiations. It's to the US to some extent, yes, more than to NATO, and at the same time, it's up to the Europeans, let's say, to take a courageous step towards, let's say, the settlement of this crisis.
Jacques and Bidlish, thank you very much indeed. I'll try to get the other guests in very quickly now because we're running out of time. John Herbst, Biden, when he was elected, said that the US is back in Europe. He promised a different perspective, a different relationship, and maybe there are some signs of that. We've heard from Blinken saying that they're ready in case something happens. Biden's promised to help with energy supply if Nord Stream 2 is cut out. Can he do that?
He can do it, or he can't do it fully, but he can do it substantially. And we're seeing diplomacy, economic diplomacy right now, in terms of reaching out to suppliers like Qatar. But I think it's also true that just as the Germans made their energy situation more difficult by shutting off the nuclear reactors, Biden has made our geopolitical energy situation more difficult by, let's say, discouraging exploitation of hydrocarbons in the United States. One of Trump's triumphs was making the United States the greatest energy producer in the world. Biden bowing to his left flank in the Democratic Party shut a lot of that down, which made us less ready to deal with the crisis today. And sadly, even though this is a true crisis and the administration is doing things to address it, they're unwilling to reconsider that decision. And that's a mistake in my judgment.
John, thank you very much indeed. Maria Zalkina, can I bring you in for a reflection really on life being based where you are in Warsaw, clearly within, on one side, the shadow of Russia, of course. People in Ukraine might look towards Poland and think, well, maybe our life could be better than it is, perhaps if we follow the same path of the Poles. Would you agree with that basically Poland is better off today because of being part of the EU?
Yes, of course, but I would like to say that I'm living for two cities right now, between Kiev and Warsaw, and Ukraine is my homeland, and my life is there. Actually, but of course, Ukrainians think that as soon as country is a member of the European Union or is a member of NATO, this is the much more secure, and in terms of much more secure than without any, union. And there were a lot of references to the history, but I think that we have to look at the present and to the future. And when it comes to Ukraine, so after 2014, Ukrainian perceptions of NATO and what NATO means actually has dramatically changed. Before 2014, only 13% of Ukrainians believed that membership in NATO was the best way to guarantee national security of Ukraine. As of now, it is 53%, and only 7% of Ukrainians, as of now, believe that military and political union and cooperation with NATO, with Russia, will guarantee national security of Ukraine. 7%. And I think we have to look at these figures, at these numbers, not at something which took place like 20 or 30 years ago.
Here we say, Maria, thank you very much indeed. Her heart is in Kiev. She's speaking to us from Warsaw. A nice perspective on both sides, Poland, Ukraine there. Final word to Nikolai Petrov. Nikolai, we've got no time, so please be brief if you can. What are we going to see between now, next few days? Is Russia going to move?
I think Russia will move, but not in a direction which is prescribed by the White House. I am not waiting for serious military operations, although I think it's very important for Putin, who did start with humiliating NATO and the United States with a kind of ultimatum, to continue moving in this direction. So far, the West is not eager to take his conditions, and he should do something in order to demonstrate Ukraine and everybody else that the mere membership in NATO does not fix problems, and NATO is not strong enough, is not cannot serve as a protector, and that's why they should think in terms of reaching certain compromises with Russia as well.
Nikolai Petrov of Chatham House in London, thank you, sir, for joining us. Thanks to Maria Zolkina, speaking in Warsaw, her heart in Kiev, as she said, but speaking to us from Poland. Thank you to John Herbst, joining us from Washington, D.C., John Herbst of the Atlantic Council. Thank you, sir, for your analysis. And thanks, of course, to our guest here in the studio, Drakin Bitterlich, former European diplomatic and security policy advisor to the German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl. Thank you, sir, for your insight. Thanks to you all. And most of all, thanks to you all for watching. Stay with us. You're watching France 24.